Hello, today is Thursday, July 13th, 2023 at 12:40 p.m. My name is Marguerite LaPlant, and today I'm interviewing Mr. Hamilton, Tony Hamilton, at the Rocky Mountain Regional VA Medical Center in Aurora, Colorado as part of the Remembering Our Veterans program. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Thank you, Mimi.
So, first off, we're going to talk about some of your early years. So, can you tell me about your childhood and where you were born?
I grew up in Washington, D.C., Southeast. Um, as I left to enter the service, I left from Washington, D.C., off on a bus ride to Baltimore, Maryland, to the AFE station, and then into Fort Jackson, South Carolina, July the 13th, 1976.
So before you entered the service, did you have any siblings, or what was it kind of like growing up in DC?
I have two older sisters, a multitude of cousins. My mother had 8 sisters.
Wow.
So they produced a lot of large families back then, and each had a boy. So I have, like I said, a number of cousins still left back in Washington area. And I went to school at Ballou Senior High School in Southeast Washington, D.C., near Bowling Air Force Base.
So did you decide to enlist after high school, or what did that look like, you getting into your
It
career in the
actually
military?
was a very funny trip. They had some recruiters come to the school one day, Ballou Senior High School, and I just happened to stop at a recruiting station on the way home off of Good Hope Road to see what the recruiter had to say. And next thing I know, they asked me to take a battery of tests, right? Take this test, take that AFSCAP test, and my scores came back pretty high, and they called me. And that's how I ended up joining the Army. Actually started off as a fluke. I never really had planned to, but then as I was listening to him, he threw out some very long, intelligible names, like cryptographic telecommunication specialist. I had no idea what that field on it, but the names sound long and impressive. I said, okay, I'll look it up in the dictionary, and still didn't really know what it entailed. And I said, okay, it was a long and professional, long title. So I said, I'll take a shot at it. It turns out it was dealing with telecommunication.
So is that where you were doing for after basic training, you started being trained to do that position?
That's correct, at Fort Gordon, Georgia. So I went to Fort Jackson. From Fort Jackson, they sent us to Fort Gordon, Georgia, which was, at that time, the basic training had just started at Fort Gordon, and still wasn't quiet. Men were men on that side, and women were at Fort Jackson. But I went there for schooling as a telecommunications center specialist.
Did that take a lot of training?
Oh yes, it was. I want to say it was 14 to 16 weeks.
Okay, that's quite a bit longer than you hear some of the advanced training. So what was kind of it like being at basic training and doing this advanced training? Did you make a lot of friends? What was kind of the environment
You meet
like?
a lot of friends. You meet a lot of friends coming out of basic training as well as going into AIT. The difference is when you get your first assignment, that's when it all comes apart. I have friends when I left Fort Gordon, graduated. Some went off to Germany. I got my first assignment was at Fort Eustis, Virginia. And so when you split off, you're still writing each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm laughing because some they got sent overseas. They got mad. But you don't have any decision. You really don't.
Yeah.
They send you where they need you. So my first assignment was in Fort Eustis, Virginia. And it just so happened I had a job as a computer machine operator.
So what did that entail? What did that look like?
It entailed monitoring the computer, putting in, they used to have data punch cards where you type in certain things. That particular facility was the Transportation Center Brigade schooling. When you say, well, what is that? That entails all the officers that's in the Transportation Corps. We used to provide, there was a system called TREADS, which is the TRADOG educational data system, and all of the for the training that those guys had to obtain, we used to do the grading system. So my job was to provide the results of the grading system to TRADOG, how many people passed, how many failed, etc., which used to get sent up to the Pentagon.
Oh, wow.
So I had those, back then we have the thing called batch programs. You submit them in, type them in, and then overnight it'll process, and you take out the printout for the next day. The instructors could go over the grading systems that the people would show what the people would pass and who had failed.
So how many years did you spend doing that?
First time was 2 years.
In Virginia?
Yes, in
Okay.
Virginia, Fort Eustis, Virginia. Here's what's interesting. So I used to go in at probably 2 o'clock, leave about maybe 1:30. One night, I was just waiting on a job to process. We used to call them batch jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And I was playing on the computer, right? You're not supposed to, but you're born because you're just waiting. And I was just drawing little things on the keyboard, which went on the CRT monitor. And I was doing this, just making designs. And I got a call. It came from Pentagon. And they said, would you stop doing that? I didn't know that anybody could see me, right? I thought it was all remote. And they said, would you stop doing that? I'm like, I'm only here. I obviously never told my boss. And I was, making designs on the screen, just like the old Etch-a-Sketch.
Yeah.
And they said, would you stop doing that? And the reason is those designs that I was making was showing up at the other end.
Oh, the Pentagon was seeing your
yes
games.
And I was like, okay. I thought it was totally, innocent. Didn't think anybody could do anything. Yeah. And that's how I initially got into it. So then I started taking computer program courses online. I went to some training at Fort Monroe, which was TRADOG headquarters. But the biggest thing is that I started taking courses online in computer programming. And back in those days, it was COBOL, Fortran, and Assembly, one of the biggest. And that was 1977.
Oh, wow.
There was a little bit in school or AIT, but most of that was the teletype. And they had the 98. So telecommunication is a process of sending messages from one place to another. Mm-hmm. And that's really the definition of telecommunications. So as I started out that's how I started. They took that MOS at that time, which was a 72 Echo, and when I went to Fort Eustis, the first assignment, that assignment is a 74 Delta, which is computer machine operator. So they figure if you had training in this area, you have training on the automated side. And the only difference is the teletypes, the big gawky machines we call them, versus the more lightweight mobile laptop type activities we have today.
I mean, it sounds like you were doing a lot of learning on the job because they kept moving you around, and obviously the technology was probably changing so quickly that you were constantly learning.
Yes, and I enjoy that. You enjoy that as a young soldier because you're learning things new. Mm-hmm. You ain't got to worry about getting born at that time because it's always what I call real-time activities, and people need to respond to real-time situations.
So how long were you stationed at
Fort
Eustis in Virginia before you left?
For the first time, I want to say 2 years, and then I got transferred. My first assignment overseas, I went to Frankfurt, and I was assigned to Berlin, Germany.
Wow.
Oh, the hot spot.
So what year was this when you were in Berlin?
1970, 78, 77, 78.
Oh, wow. You were really there in some hot years.
Yes.
What was that like in Berlin? What were you doing?
Those were the years when I'm going to throw out a guy's name who really got us famous. His name was Geraldo Rivera for NBC. He came over to Europe and he did his first big special on NBC News. That interview actually cultivated his professional career. He came over there and did an interview and said the troops in Germany were not combat ready. They was out smoking marijuana and all that other stuff. I got a letter from my father, which I never really expected. We just take it for granted. And he happened to see it on a Sunday, I think it was 60 Minutes, and happened to say, son, are you involved in that? Well, I was a young soldier. The answer is No, Dad. But it was a wake-up call because we didn't know what they was putting on the news back in the United States. And the guy who did it, and it actually took off his career. That's what made him a little famous. Was Geraldo Rivera, who came over there and did the special, okay, and took it back. And so Allied Supreme Commander, which is Alexander Haig, and General Adams says we can't have that. So they created a thing where the troops, even after you work a 12-hour shift, you got off and you had to do what we became what we call combat ready. They had us running 5 miles a day with a backpack and all that other stuff. It makes sense as we was in Berlin Brigade, because Berlin was a prime center point of the European Army combat back those days.
The division between the East and West Bloc. Like
that's right.
You're right. I mean, I don't recall if those particular years were really hot years, but I know it was
because the Berlin Wall had not been torn down yet.
Yeah. So still waiting a couple years. Do you remember kind of what it was like living in Germany? Did you find that super interesting to be abroad for the first time?
Yes, because after a while you learn the culture, but the food culture, the light, not just the nightlife, but the timing of life was different. What I mean by that, you could come out of a certain place or facility at 2:00 in the morning and be broad daylight, especially in the northern part of Germany, in Berlin. Berlin was particularly interesting because that's the highlight of Europe. I mean, that's where everybody's a multitude of nationalities, big money. Downtown is like the New York of Europe, and the Kudam. So Berlin had an awful lot going on during those years. And again, it was before the Berlin Wall was torn down.
Yeah. So you were in Germany for a couple of years as well?
Yes, I went to Germany, or I went to Berlin. So when I came back from Berlin to come back to the United States, I really didn't like Germany. And the reason is the lifestyle over there was much more what I call open, as far as the nudity, the drugs, and all the other stuff. It's just much more open than what the United States had. So I wanted to come back home and be closer to, and I re-enlisted. At that time, they used to give you a station of choice. Where can you go? I actually wanted to go to a computer, the IBM 360 machine repairman course, and they came back and said that the course was full, or there wasn't no more openings for a year. So they gave me a choice that says, okay, what else? What's your next choice? And I said, okay, I'll go back to Fort Eustis, Virginia. The beauty of that is, once I got back stateside, it's easier to seek training than it is from overseas. And so I re-enlisted and came back to Fort Eustis, Virginia. I'm from Washington, D.C., which was a 3-hour ride, and that's how I was able to get back restationed. So they offered me a station of choice.
So was that nice, kind of being back closer to home?
Yes.
And were you able to like visit your family and your siblings kind of? I don't know, you said you had older siblings, so maybe they were off and about.
3 hours away, so I could drive to Washington, D.C. And when I first got back, I was able to get my first car.
Oh, that must have been a big deal.
Yes, it was a 1975 Chevrolet Stingray.
Ooh, and you got a good car for your first car too.
Yes.
So were you doing the similar computer work in your second shift in Virginia?
Yes, the second shift I came back and I was actually turned out to be the NCOIC of the data systems branch. So as I was taking courses, correspondence courses online, a lot of computer programming courses, I continued. When I went back from overseas, I would work in basically the same field, automated data telecommunications center. What that refers to is a fixed station environment of a lot of ADP, automated data processing equipment, providing data from the United States and around the world back to the Pentagon.
So after Virginia, were you stationed there that second time for a while? Because I know you had a 21-year career, so you must have been.
Yes, after I was still 21. I also was recruited to go out and talk to the vocational schools and the tech and the junior colleges
Okay.
in that area, the one in the Tidewater area. It was a lovely assignment. The reason is because you're young. I was just turning around 21, and I was I guess, a brand to the Army, saying, okay. And I remember telling the people, look what I've become. I didn't really know any difference, but it felt good enough for the Army to spotlight me and ask me to go out and talk to and recruit other young men and women um, as a career into the military. The good thing about that area, there's a lot of branches of services in that area. You got the Air Force, which was Langley Air Force Base. You have the Navy and the Marines down in Norfolk, Virginia. So it was a very telling and I call it coordinated environment
Yeah.
in the military system.
Seems like you were, no matter where you were assigned, you were at the center of action, or
Yes,
stuff was always going on around you, and you're part of it.
yes. And that was one of the things you like to see, especially as a young service member, because at that time you don't really know how long you're going to stay, how long.
Mm-hmm.
But it gave me an opportunity to grow. It taught me a skill. It told me my medical and all other stuff would be taken for the rest of my life. Hey, what a great deal. Um, and so that's what made me stay. My next assignment when I left there was to Saudi Arabia,
Oh, wow.
well before Desert Storm.
Good.
And so what I found is that when you come stateside, we tend to spend a lot of money. For those, I wasn't married, I was still single. So my next assignment was Saudi Arabia. And I was initially assigned to Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. And then they transferred me into Riyadh. That was called MTC Maneuver Training Command. And I'm sorry, Military Advisor, a MAG group. It's called a MAG group. What that means is there's different branches of service: Air Force, Army, Navy, and everybody provided a protection mission for that assignment on the Middle East. And the Army provided all the communications for the Middle East.
So that was what you were doing. You were doing the communications and kind of coordinating between the branches.
Right. And the Air Force had control because some people might know it as F1. We provided security for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The U.S. military did. Okay, U.S. military provided kingdom. Most people know about Bahrain and the Navy.
Yeah.
But we were in land and in place providing reports and communication of the aircraft that provided the security over the kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Was this a time where you saw conflict in Saudi Arabia, or was it mostly just you were doing the communications and guard duty and like?
It was right after the conflict in the Shah of Iran.
Okay.
So Saudi Arabia wasn't really known, or at least the protection that we provided was not well advertised. But you make no doubt, U.S. military is the one who provided the kingdom to the RSAF, which was the Royal Saudi Air Force, helped train them on the F-14 aircraft. So we were there, but not there. And let me be clear. On the military advisory group, you're there, but you're not there. You're really there to provide training and backup for that sovereign nation. And later on, it came out or became public that U.S. military was providing the security for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And the deal was, it was a 10-year agreement to allow us to train up their troops so that they could start manning their own aircraft, et cetera, and to provide the security for their own kingdom.
Yeah, I've never even heard about that. I didn't know that was something that was even done. And I feel like I have more history knowledge maybe than the average person, but
it'll come out.
It's
it eventually
fascinating.
comes out, and some people will know it's the same kind of way where we're there, but we don't need to advertise it that we're there and providing security. So the way that those countries was kind of built, remember this is back in the 80s, you either went to the Soviet or US. Those are the two world powers.
Yeah.
So at that time, I believe Russia was still doing a lot of stuff in Afghanistan. US military had some of the other countries Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, and it's you either go with us or you go with them. It's basically what it amounted to.
Yeah. I mean, it was definitely 20, 30 years in there where
Yes,
the U.S. had their fingers in half the countries in the world. You see
that's right.
us, and I guess you always forget that
That is
about
correct.
Saudi Arabia, that they were still there. So, you weren't there for the full 10 years in Saudi Arabia, though. You were just there
No,
for a little bit.
I was in there almost 2 years, and then the next assignment when I left Saudi Arabia, I went to Frankfurt, Germany.
Back to Germany, okay,
Yes, Frankfurt,
but
which is
not Berlin. Okay.
right. So in order to get to Berlin, you got to stop through Frankfurt. At that time, on the second tour into Germany, Frankfurt Rhein was known as the gateway to Europe. All the communication and everything, before you even get to other parts of Germany, you must stop and get processed there. I decided to stay there because at that time we was just putting in a new system called the AMI, Automated Multimedia Exchange. This was the highlight, the improve the communication flow from different parts and around the world, and from Washington, D.C., from the Pentagon. So it got to the point where the idea was to pick up the phone. You don't have to dial it. It automatically rang to the headquarters. And that was the beginning of that, in the early 80s. And I was decided, when I came out of Saudi Arabia, they offered me, again, a station of choice because at that time, Saudi Arabia was considered a hardship tour. And they said you can go to the Pentagon or you can go anywhere you want. Well, during that period, it was Reaganomics. So I really wasn't interested in coming back to the United States. I wanted to save some more money. That's the beauty of having a lot of those assignments overseas. You're there to work, so you don't have really a lot of money to spend. Okay, and it kind of depends on how you balance it and budget it. You can build it. And I wanted to pick up Mercedes and send it back, but the dollar wasn't as strong against the German mark when I went back in the 80s. Okay, and plus they required a whole bunch of changes on the vehicles that didn't used to exist before the 80s.
Yeah, when Germany's expanding their manufacturing,
Yes.
things are kind of changing in the trade world in this period. So did you like Frankfurt better than Berlin?
Oh, yes.
Was that more your
Yes,
style?
and the reason is Frankfurt gave you much easier access to travel to other countries, whether it be Spain, Holland, other points of Europe, because a lot of the communication or travel flows start right out of Frankfurt, whether it's aircraft, Rhein-Main, Lufthansa, and again, you could have a weekend trip to go to Paris or Spain.
Ooh.
Oh, I miss those days. And when you're young, you want to travel and see different parts, Amsterdam, Holland. So that was the beauty and what I liked about Frankfurt.
That sounds awesome that you got to do a lot of weekend trips and really experience Europe, not just Germany. Did that kind of make it hard getting back to the stateside, or were you pretty excited to get home after all that time there?
So what happened later in the 80s, they had these radical groups that started to come online that at that time you could easily identify an American through the green tags versus the white German tags. And we became an easy symbol of attack. And so they started these radical groups, Irish Republican Army, they started attacking American soldiers and their living quarters. And what I mean by that, they would put bombs under cars, bombs in underground parking garages, etc. And that's what made me say it's time for me to get out of here. And the reason is I didn't want to be nobody's excuse. So I said, okay, in 83, I'll take a chance. Let's go back. We used to refer to coming back to the United States, the world. Okay, you've seen it in some of the tips on it. People say, okay, I'm welcome back to the world. And they'll go down and kiss the ground. Well, we always refer to U.S. soil as the world. So when I got back, I said, if it doesn't work out, I'll come back. So I said it was time for me to look for other jobs. And that's what made me get back or come back to the United States. I went back to Washington, D.C., and which is a big area for defense contractors. And that's what started working in the defense industry. And I decided to go into the Army Reserve, versus just to walk away from it totally. So I had 13 years of reserve service and 7.5 years of active Army.
Did you ever get called up from the reserves, or were you able to avoid getting called back?
No, what I did is I worked into a very unique position. My first assignment was with FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Oh, yeah.
And then the next one was the First Maneuver Training Command. What that job entailed is to monitor, evaluate, and train National Guard and U.S. Army Reserve soldiers on the unit's METAL, which stands for Mission Essential Task List. So we used to go out and evaluate, train those before they got deployed to go overseas or wherever. And that was the role of the First Maneuver Training Command. So those was great things. The last 5 years of it, I was a senior instructor in communications for the Army. It used to be 5046 U.S. Army Reserve School.
So even though you were in the Army Reserves, you were still doing basically military work
Oh,
for
yes.
all
Oh,
those
yes.
years.
Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, and sometimes Wednesdays. So the training I really enjoyed because you're showing the skills that you had to some other soldiers who are just coming up through the ranks, and that was very rewarding.
What was it like working for FEMA? That's pretty interesting.
Oh, that was very interesting. So when most people think about FEMA, we think of national disasters. Well, again,
Hurricanes. Yeah.
military helps in that area too. We help pinpoint, locate certain areas, and help in the coordination and transportation of assets going to those areas, not just in the military. So that's really the role of FEMA does. It just so happens that FEMA has military billets assigned to it.
I didn't know that about FEMA. I think that does make sense when you think of, in emergencies, people tend to get a little lawless sometimes. So that would make sense. So in all those years of service, is there any particular like humorous or funny event that really sticks out to you?
I would say the most funny and rewarding thing is the fact that you give back. You get to travel and go to different counties, countries, as well as states, and they're all different. But the most important thing is you get to meet people from all different walks of life. Okay, and that you can't, you just can't teach in college. They can theory, but until you see that person and get into that environment, you never appreciate the beauty of another human being.
That is beautiful. Seems like one of the best parts about your service was just getting to see the world and the people in it.
Yes, and traveling. That's the biggest thing I take away from it.
Were you awarded any medals or citations for
Yes.
your service? I imagine you had to have been.
Yes, I have six ARCOMs, Army Commendation Medals. I got one MSN, Military Service Medals, and I think that's it. Now, strangely enough, most of them came when I was in. I got a couple on active duty, but most of them came when I was on in reserve. And the reason is I used to go evaluate units in Army Reserve and help set up the communication emergency, what we call EOC, Emergency Operational Centers, and get the communication flowing. And that was always turned out to be rewarding. And the fact that people acknowledge my skills and training when we have to go out and do what I call exercise in the summer. What I also learned was that I learned to take a much better appreciation for the everyday soldier versus the National Guard and Reserve. See, they may not look as sharp with the fully hair because you have to turn off one mindset and turn on another. But I learned that it takes a lot more to switch gears from what we call the regular day-to-day lifestyle versus being a military member where you're always expected to be in 100% gear and military mindset. And I learned to have an appreciation for those who are able to shift the gears.
Was that transition once you were done with the reserves and you were completely out? Was that kind of hard transition for you?
I think so, in the sense that I had a freer or more time for the family on the weekends, and I could enjoy the weekends and do activities with the family when I retired. And I did that right after Desert Storm.
So you said you retired right after Desert Storm.
Correct.
Was it related to Desert Storm in any way, or you just felt like you were kind of done?
No, it was relate. So what the military goes through, upsides and downsides. Right after Desert Storm, they didn't need the higher number of service and troops, so they was looking, and they did. They went through what we call a reconsolidation effort, and it turned everything in the whole United States into 4 brigades. And there was 4 brigades, one that represented different areas of the country, and so they have what we call regions. Region 8 has 13 states assigned to it. That's what Denver is.
Okay.
And in the 13 states, there's Salt Lake, Oregon, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and a number of other states in there that
The
represent.
flyovers.
Yes,
not
that
to insult the
represent
flyover states, of course.
to represent the region 8, and then there's different regions, and that's how it was split up. And they conducted and decided that's the way we're going to do training for the rest of the forces. And that's common for forces or the military to readjust and expand the training and knowledge of the forces based on the mission that it's currently faced or forced with at that time.
That's really interesting. So during that transition period, you didn't re-enlist, and then you transitioned to just regular civilian life, or what did you
Right.
start doing?
After I retired, and the reason is because it was downsized and closing up the base.
Uh-huh.
One of them used to be over here at Fitzsimmons.
Oh, yes.
So if you may remember back then, Fitzsimmons was closing up the hospital, and they moved all of the assets to different places in the world. Some in Oregon, some in Vancouver Barracks, some in Montana, some in California, some in Salt Lake City. As they closed up or realigned those assets, the need for a big, stronger force wasn't needed any longer in Fitzsimmons. So they closed up Fitzsimmons and started moving assets to other states, and they took on that mission.
So you mentioned that after you retired, you spent a little more time with your family. So were you married by this point?
Yes, I was married, 3 kids.
How did you guys meet?
My wife graduated from Elmore Community College in Iowa, and her and a bunch of girlfriends moved down to Denver. They call it the big city, and that's how they got their jobs. I was recruited or came here. I was recruited by Mark Marietta, Denver Aerospace, as a young software engineer back in the 80s. And
So this was during the reserves, or?
well, when I got recruited by Mark Marietta, I joined the reserves to FEMA once I got here.
Oh, okay.
And thought I would only stay 1 or 2, 3 years, and then end up being 30.
Yeah, I mean, you're still here.
Yes, still here.
So
Family's all grown.
So you guys, when did you have your kids?
First one was 1989. It was a daughter, Shanice.
Okay, so while you were still in the reserves.
Yes.
And then you have a son as well?
I have the next one was another daughter.
Another daughter, okay.
Alicia, and she was born 3 years later, right? Generally, I would like to say my kids are 3.5 to 5 years apart. Okay, all of them. And then the last one was Jerron, and he was born in 1998. So 89 to 93 was the next one. And then in 98 was I hate to use the word final, but the boy, Jerron. That was more of a truly planned, because we took a big long vacation to Disney World and scheduled out time in the planning and preparation of Jerron.
I bet he's going to love hearing that story.
Yes.
So when you were out of the service, you said that you did more defense work, right? Or what were you doing after the reserves in Denver?
Yes, I am a defense contractor, so I was able to do more for them through what I call my system engineering skills for the Defense Department. Not just one branch, but primarily for the Department of Defense. So you represent all branches. And as I worked as a defense contractor, I was able to bring more skill sets to to represent and support the mission of the military.
So you mentioned aerospace engineering as well. How did you kind of transition from doing more computer-based work to doing aerospace?
As I start moving up through the ranks, I used to do a lot of what we call corporate study. Um, so when I first came out here, Mark Marietta, which is at that time was one of the number one defense contractors, we had a thing called MMU, Main Maneuvering Unit. It was the first device that would allow you to maneuver in space. And I was pretty impressed and stoked about that,
Yeah.
saying that's pretty neat. And so they had a huge library, big, huge library. And I decided, well, let's go in there and do. Here's one of the beauties of coming out. If you don't know anybody, you won't get sidetracked. And I decided to study in the library and research things. And that's how my love for aerospace decided to grow. And I would just study and read it. And so after about a year and a half or two, I was learning more and more. And that's how it started. People started to take notice and say, hey, I'd like for you to come help me with this or help me with that. And that's how I started to learn about aerospace.
So were you with Marietta for a really long time?
I was with Mark Marietta. Then I left and I went to Digital Software Corporation. Again, these are all defense contracting companies. And I stayed with Digital for about maybe 12 years. And then I went back to Lockheed Martin as Lockheed Martin was starting to merge. Well, Lockheed had purchased Martin Marietta, and it was starting to merge. That's how Lockheed Martin came to be. And
I don't know that.
after I left Lockheed Martin, I went to the Aerospace Corporation, and I worked for the Aerospace Corporation. So these are companies that not just in the Denver metro area or state of Colorado. They headquartered in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, which was two other prime areas of where we call the money capital, SMC, that controls the defense budget. And that's how I got into that field.
When you were working there, did you travel to the other cities
Yes.
a lot?
Oh, yes. Traveled to the East Coast and the West Coast. Can't name the facilities, but that's where a lot of decision making was done.
Sounds like you were, even when you were in the military, you were doing all this like cross communications between branches and advanced computer work. And when you're out of it, you're still not really out of it. You're still working with
I'm able to contribute more and do more for them as I moved up the ranks and, helping them or policymakers make good decisions. So I was able to do more for them as I moved into what I call a defense contractor as a company, because we're basically advising them and assisting them and making good quality decisions to support the mission that they got to perform.
Did you really enjoy doing that work?
Oh, yes, I did.
Sounds like, especially after your time officially in the military, you really blossomed because you're finally able to use your smarts and intelligence without being like reined in at all.
That's correct. And so that was a very rewarding and exciting career.
So outside of your career, what are some hobbies and things that you've been enjoying in retirement?
I'm a musician. I'm also a drummer, and I play fusion, jazz, rock and roll, and R&B. I like to do things that brings people together in a good positive spirit.
Yeah.
And keep us happy.
So how did you get into drumming? Is that something you've always done?
I've always started. I started out as I used to be in the marching band, high school marching band, and that's I started off in the early '70s. Just had a feel for drumming, and as I was in high school, I went to the high school marching band because you had to have something to start off with. The high school marching band was the way to go, and I started doing it as I continued and traveled throughout the military. I played when I was overseas. Matter of fact, we won the Commandant's Musical World Award.
Wow.
And the Signals Company. I got some old pictures there. And I just kind of stayed with it and then followed it. And then as I got older, I got my own set, started playing probably first couple of bands, I want to say, in the late 80s after the daughter was born, 88, 89. And just stuck with it. And the word got around and people started asking me to join the band.
That's pretty awesome. I can tell it seems like a lot of the things that you've done in your life are really social and like helping bring people together and working with people from all over. And you can see that in your hobbies too.
Yes, yes. Because I think that's important, and I think we all need to live in an environment where we all can communicate, have fun.
Mm.
I think that leads for a healthier lifestyle and a healthier environment, not just on the people, but the environment that's left alone or that's left after you leave. So I really kind of believe in that and think we all should inspire to leave it much better than it was when you arrived.
That's beautiful. I completely agree. It seems like, I mean, you've got these beautiful children, kind of a little bit of your legacy beyond all the amazing things you've already done in your life. Do you still get to spend a lot of time with your
I
family? Are they
do.
around?
I do. And now I got grandkids.
Oh,
So there's grandkids and grandkids. The good thing is, so I have 4 grandkids, and they live further up north. So we spend the weekends with them because it's nice to be able to see them come up through the ranks and grow and learn new
mm-hmm.
things, and also providing that security for them. And I call it it's called giving back, right? When I give back to some others, just like here at the VA, I come here and I like to be able to help contribute or make another, not just the veterans, but anybody's day happier and smoother for them. Makes you feel good when you're doing something for somebody else.
Yeah. Um, so just kind of reflecting on your service, what would you say? Because I know you've talked a lot about kind of that reflections on connecting and communicating. Would you say that's one of the biggest life lessons you've learned from service, or what are some of those big life lessons to take away?
I think the biggest life lesson is that don't judge a book by its cover, okay? And take it for what it is, and always be what you can be. Okay, that's all. Be what you can be. And what I mean by that, learn, let it give back. The more you give, the better you'll receive.
Karma.
Mhm.
Yeah, put good energy out into the world and the people around you.
Yeah, so I'd always tell people to always be what you can be.
Is there anything that you miss about being in the service, or anything that you're glad to be done with, have left behind?
No, I think the experience of meeting different people from different walks of life and traveling around the world is the two most important things that I got out of it. And no, do I miss it? Because obviously, as we get older, we don't travel or go as far enough to the moon as we can, and we don't want. And there's a what I mean by that. There's a comfort zone that we all like to stay in, and I'm fairly happy with what I've seen, what I've been taught, and what I've been able to do with the things and avenues that I've been provided.
And now you're kind of able to pass on some of the things you've learned to other
Yes,
people. So, you said that you got to travel and learn from everyone else, and now we get to learn from you,
that's right. Well,
keeping it going. Speaking of that, what would you say, just a final thing, is there any message you would like to leave for future generations who would hear your story?
I would say be all that you can be. That means never give up. Then you might run into some rough days here, but never quit. Quitters never win, winners never quit.
Well, thank you so much for coming in today. This was a great interview.
Well,
I
thank you.
really enjoyed talking to you.
All right, I enjoyed sharing with you all as well.